Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Alice, and I am an instructor from Canada. And today I'll be talking about what swimming exactly does, how it's not just a sport, but how it helps those with autism connect and communicate and socialize. So let's begin. If I can check. Okay, hopefully you can see this. So, um, like I said, swimming is more than a sport. And I remember the first time that I worked with an ASD kid. He was 7 years old and I was just 16. Trust me, I was terrified. And one thing that you learn when you start teaching is that everything is kind of like a cookbook, right? Like one step at a time, this. When I started working with this kid, he ended up teaching me that, swimming is not just a sport and it's not something that is just like a recipe. Swimming is adaptive. You adapt the stroke for the swimmer, not the other way around. And I learned that, and it was by far one of my favorite kids that I worked with. So I'm gonna kind of explain how this works today. So today I'm going to talk about exactly what kind of environment the water creates. And so how exactly is it that the water environment changes the perspective and the sensory and how exactly it helps thrive those kids, right? I will then talk about the benefits of swimming, not just the physical ones, but the emotional ones and the mental ones and how exactly they connect. And then at the end, I will kind of talk about the teaching process, how you can teach at home or how to find the right instructor, just because I understand that it's not the easiest thing to do every now and then. So, the environment that water creates. Now, water is actually very, very interesting because it creates this very calming, slow environment. I don't know if you've ever been swimming, right, or if you just float around, you kind of feel like everything is, okay. Everything is calm, everything is relaxed. And that is because of three very major components: buoyancy, resistance, and hydrostatic pressure. Now, buoyancy is basically when water works against gravity, right? So it's basically that you can float around, and more importantly, that you feel 3 times lighter than you actually are, which is why water helps a lot of like rehab patients and anyone who's nervous, right? Because it lifts off a lot of the weight and it's just a lot easier to move. Now, the resistance part is actually very, very interesting because and I'll come back to it in a second, but when I say resistant, it's basically the pressure that water creates. So when you move through the water, you can feel that you're moving, and I will talk about how that's significant in 1 second. So, the buoyancy and the hydrostatic pressure, it's basically the pressure that creates in the water, right? So when you go deeper down, everything feels a little bit heavier. Now, that kind of what it happens, it slows down your heart rate, and more importantly, it helps with muscle spasms, so it reduces them. Now, buoyancy and hydrostatic pressure, basically the idea of like being light and calm, it helps a lot with sensory overload, right? It calms down, which is why it helps a lot of kids with ASD because they have an overwhelming, sensories, right? There's everything is very, very overwhelming and they feel stressed. But once they're in the water, because of the buoyancy and the hydrostatic pressure, their senses kind of calm down and they're able to focus and relax a bit. Now, resistance is the other very, very important part. What, sorry, my dog just came. So, resistance, what happens is that it's basically how you move through the water, right? So if I move my hand like this, I don't really feel a difference, right? But in the water, you can feel the water moving through your fingers, and you can feel it if you close the fingers, you can feel the difference of how the water moves, right? And what that does with kids with ASD is that it helps them realize more what mistakes are being made, right? It makes them realize and more aware of what movements are created and what body parts are moving. So again, if I move my hand, I'm aware that there's a difference between my hands open and my hands closed. But for ASD kids, it might be a little bit harder to recognize. So in the water, when they can feel the difference in the pressure, it helps them realize more, and therefore it's easier to learn. Now, the fifth most important one, which I think is actually very much overlooked, is the diverse communication. So it is often perceived when you swim that, you only talk in one language, you just speak. But when you swim, there is more than one way to communicate, right? You can talk, yes. You can also start moving, right? The amount of times I've grabbed a kid and I moved their hand for them, or I manipulated them, that's another way of communicating. Kids also communicate among themselves. It is honestly amazing how I've seen kids, right, who'll just have like 2 buckets of water, complete silence, yet they're playing with those buckets. That is also a way of communication. Now, how this helps is that kids with ASD struggle with one form of communication, right? But when they're put in this environment, when there's more than one, it is a lot easier for them to communicate. I've worked with this one kid who communicated through songs. So if I talk to her just like I'm talking to you right now, she will have trouble understanding. But if I use one of her favorite lullabies or songs, such as Row Row the Boat, she absolutely loved that. And I kind of used that to teach her. She understood it better. Her brain processed it, and she was able to actually do the movements. So that's kind of like the diverse communication. And then the kid that I was talking about, the very first one that I've taught, he communicated using numbers, right? So every movement would kind of be like a sequence of numbers. So when he jumped, I would say 1, 2, 3. That is his way. So instead of saying the word jump, he would say 1, 2, 3. But yeah. So the benefits of swimming, like I said, communication and communication skills. Because of the very diverse environment, communication skills are easier to build. But more importantly, is swimming is kind of like a bonding experience, right? Like kids love going, especially now in the summer. Kids love bonding in the pool, right? Playing and stuff like that. That is also a form of communication. Now, how exactly this happens is through confidence. And confidence is created through motor skills. So motor skills, I don't exactly just mean, moving through water, hand strokes and stuff like that. When you're in the water, you have to be stable. That is the very first thing that you learn, how to be stable in the water, which means how to float, how to move without tipping over, and all of that. And it is easier to connect with kids in the water. And the reason for this is because ASD kids, or even kids with disabilities, or those who are neurodivergent, right, when they walk on land, they're very much aware, right, that they might be walking wrong, or that they're not walking like this other kid. They're aware that this is happening. Now, in the water, because of the environment, right, because like the buoyancy and like the calming of everything, that kind of helps. But more importantly, everyone starts at ground zero, right? I've never met a kid who just jumped into the water and just started swimming like an Olympic swimmer. That has never once happened, right? So everybody starts at ground zero. And that way for ASD kids, it's a lot easier to bond, right? Because they don't feel like an outsider. They kind of like realize that they're on the same level or a similar level as the rest of them, right? And that's kind of like the motor skills that I'm talking about. You all start at the same boat at the bottom, and you slowly learn how to like move through the water, how to walk, how to like move. That is your motor skills. Now, what this does is it builds confidence, and I've seen this many times. Okay, first things, ASD kids are very nervous, and it's not just ASD kids, a lot of kids, right, when they first go into the water, they're very nervous. And then what happens is sorry. Then what happens is that everything calms down, right? Again, because they're in that environment and because they're in ground zero, everything calms down. That is the very first thing. And the second thing is that in swimming, because of that resistance, you're able to recognize more achievements. And that is very important, because through those small achievements, a kid becomes more confident, right? They're kind of like, oh, okay, I can do this, right? I just did this, I can do the next thing. And that's kind of like the confidence that I'm talking about. And that's created through motor skills. Even just blowing bubbles, a simple task like that builds that confidence. And then through that, kids are able to kind of communicate more and become more socially aware. And what I mean by that is that they're actually more excited to be there. I had taught this one kid, his name was Ivan, a year ago. And when I first got him, he was really nervous in the water. He was jittery. His dad had to sit on deck, and everything was very nervous, right? He would jump. He would recognize that water is terrifying, and he wasn't afraid. He would just jump in. He couldn't listen, right? And then we started doing repetitive motions, which is very much recommended when you teach kids with ASD, right? You repeat the same motions. And we started floating on his back. Initially, it was very rocky, he was still acting out and everything. But once you realize that he's able to float, his social awareness also improved because he was able to recognize with me, right, like what to do and what not to do, right? And then he was able to sit, he was able to learn, and he was able to communicate with other kids. He played with the other kids just because of that increased and boost in confidence. So how exactly they connect, I kind of went over that, but I'll just re-explain it. So the motor skills, right, you create by making goals, right? Those goals are vital, but more importantly, what's important is the very, very, very strong kind of emotions, okay? So with kids with ASD, you can't just be, good job. You have to be very obvious with your emotions. You know, if they did something good, smile, like a lot. If they're doing something that you know might be dangerous, you know, shake your head, make something very, very obvious. At the time, yes, it will be rocky, but then over time, they'll realize those habits and they'll start adapting and they'll start learning. And again, they'll feel more confident. And once they feel more confident in themselves and in their skills, they're more likely to develop social skills and to develop communication skills. And it's not just like, you know, connecting with kids by playing with those water buckets. I've met kids who were completely nonverbal, and then over time, they started picking up small words, right? Like the kid, the very first one that I've taught, he was nonverbal, right? And then over time, he started recognizing that he can do bubbles. He became confident in doing bubbles. And bubbles is basically when you just blow into the water, right? He became aware of it, that he's doing it. He kind of figured out how to do it. And then he started connecting words. He would be like, blow it, and then he would say the word bubble, which was honestly very extraordinary. I was very, very proud of him. And what this does is that it helps create future developments for future habits, right? It basically, kids are becoming more aware of the social norms, right? Like if I shake my head, don't do that. And then even then, it will become to a time when they don't need me to kind of like recognize it. Like that kid that I've taught, Ivan, the one a year ago, the one who was very jittery, over time he ended up realizing that when it's not his turn, he's gonna sit on the deck on his bum, you know, and be very, very careful, and he can only get into the water once it's his turn. He started realizing that, and that it's again is because of all of that confidence, and again because kids around him made it seem okay, like everything, you know, everybody connected. And that's basically how swimming works, right? It's basically this environment, and because they're aware of the mistakes that they can make, and they're aware of their movements, and they're aware how to do everything, they're able to learn. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen like within the first month or within the second month. No, it might take some time. Like I've taught kids, sometimes it took me 6 months, right, to teach one stroke. That's not a big deal. It happens. It's not the end of the world, but they will end up doing it. Nothing is gonna kind of make it seem like they can't do it. They can. You just need to be more patient, and you need to be okay and just keep encouraging them. That's basically the main goal. Now, the teaching process. So what I'm going to talk about here is basically swimming and aqua therapy, because I do get a question a lot, what is the difference between swimming and aqua therapy, and which one is better for kids with ASD? And then I'll teach you how to find the right class, and more importantly, how to find the right instructor, and how to develop your own lesson plan. And then I'll just show you some tricks that you can do at home. So let's say if you want to teach your kid right at the pool, or if you just want to just swim with them, right? How to do it so they're comfortable and they're confident, and then you're also okay. So basically, in a nutshell, aquatherapy is more slower and it focuses on control. You'll see it a lot with rehab patients, right? Or anyone who's like their first time in the water, right? And it's basically the idea that you move everything very slowly. You don't really focus on strokes, but you more focus on movement. That is the main difference. Now, swimming does also focus on control, right? You have to know how to control your body to swim. But on top of that, you do end up building stroke development. Now, there isn't one right way, okay? A lot of kids with ASD, they do start not specifically in aquatherapy, but something similar along those lines, right? Something very slow, so they realize the water, right, how it works, what it is, right, and they recognize what it is. Now, I will tell you this, that a lot of instructors, if you just sign them up into classes, they will recognize that some kid require that approach initially, and they will do it. So even if you're worried, right, that like once you go into swimming, you right away start doing strokes and kicks, that's not always the case. As instructors, our first day, we always do kind of like a little bit of everything. And the point of that is to kind of see where kids are at. And I've had kids where they initially just started by walking up and down the stairs because the water made them uncomfortable. They were uncomfortable in the water. And again, these are my ASD kids, right? It took time with them, right? That is basically aqua therapy. And after that, after we built up like that initial confidence, they were able to move up more. You know, they were able to start kicking, they were able to start floating. All of that kind of started like adding up and building up. And that's kind of like swimming, right? You will end up building on top. So don't worry too much about which one. And the second thing is, sorry, the dog, is how to find the right class, right, when it comes to swimming. So there are the difference private and group classes. Private, I'm so sorry, I think he just found like a squirrel or something. So private classes are often recommended when it comes to swimming, right? With ASD kids, I've heard that a lot. A lot of my companies, right, they recommend it to parents, start with private classes. Okay. So the thing is that private classes are not always the best case for ASD kids. And that is because they're very much isolated. I personally only recommend that when the kid is very nervous in the water initially, right? When they don't know how to do, and the ASD kid is very much unaware of what water is. That is when I recommend starting off with private classes. But I highly recommend for ASD kids to start working in groups of 3 to 4, something small, not big like 8 or 9, but 3 to 4 kids, right? And what that does is that, again, it helps them communicate with other kids. That communication is key, especially when you build that bond. Yeah, he did find the squirrel. When you build that bond, right, those kids build a bond while they work together and while they progress together, right, they do end up building that bond. And it helps a lot with ASD kids because, one, it helps them socialize, right? They realize more social norms, they learn how to communicate. Again, it might not be just talking, but they do end up learning how to communicate in those small classes, right? And the second is that they will feel more confident in themselves. If you isolate a kid, they will be under the impression, you know, they're the only ones, they're not good enough, something is weird with them, something is different with them. It's very common. And I've taught many private classes and I've saw it in a lot of them, right? They feel more isolated. They're not as excited. But when you're in a small group, you're more excited to talk to people, right? You're more excited to kind of like, you see what's happening, right? You're excited to play with them while you're on your break. And that does contribute to your social standards and your communication. Now, in terms of finding the right instructor, you don't always need to find the specialist, right? Like if you Google online, it'll be like ASD swimmer specialist. That's not always the case. I personally, I am still a uni kid, but I've taught many of them and I've developed my own curriculums and everything. And the main way to find a good instructor is if you just go to like a company, right? Or even like your town pool, look for the instructor that is very, very, very hyper. And when I say that, you'll notice that there's always that one instructor who is overly excited about how the kids are doing, right? You'll see them jumping and smiling, you'll see them clapping, right? You'll see them giving a million high fives. That is the instructor that is most likely right for your kid. And the reason for that is because in my experience, and again, I've worked with many wonderful coworkers, is that those who are more likely to do those high fives and smiles right first, they're more open to being obvious about their emotions, which helps with ASD and recognizing, right, those social norms. And then the second thing that happens is that they are able to create those connections. So those instructors, and again, this is like from what I've seen, and I am one of those who will end up yelling on the pool deck if something amazing happens, right? Is that they make the effort to get to know the kid, and more importantly, they get to know what works. And that is kind of like what this new teaching style, right? This curriculum that is starting to be established, that the swimmers are not adapted to the stroke, but the stroke is adapted to the swimmer. That is the key difference, right? So you adapt the stroke, right? It can be a little bit floppy, it can be a little bit weird, but if it works for the person, it works. It does not have to be that streamlined perfection. And those instructors who are very happy and they're always high five, they learn how to recognize it. They learn how to create those connections and recognize, right, that is what this is, right. This is what I'm supposed to do. And this is what works for this kid. This kid doesn't like this. And they're more likely to adapt, right? Like a lot of the classes, and it is highly recommended, right? You start floating with you're on your back, but not a lot of kids are comfortable with that. So some instructors, those same instructors, are more likely to recognize, okay, we're going to try something different, to build up to that. And that's kind of like the right instructor. And you can talk to the managers at the company, or you can just sit down and you'll just notice they're very, very obvious. And then the right lesson plan for ASD kids. Now, you can talk to your instructor, right? And you have every right to do that, to talk to them and create some sort of lesson plan. You can ask them, right, to keep you updated. But you can also create your own lesson plan, and that is kind of like what we're going to talk about next, right? How to teach at home. And the right lesson plan, the main thing with ASD is repetition. And I don't just mean, doing the same stroke, blah, 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 but doing it by creating habits. That is the key thing, right? So you have a 30-minute session, right? You start with floating on your back. You do that for 10 minutes. Then you start floating on your front. You do that for 10 minutes, right? Well, time-wise, that's not exactly accurate. It will most likely be like 2 or 3, but that's kind of the idea, okay? You do the exact same thing every session, class. And as boring as that may sound, for ASD kids, it does help a lot because they have a repetitive behavior. So if you play to that strength, they're more likely to A, learn, and B, recognize what is being taught, and C, they will feel more comfortable coming into class because they know what's going to happen. And once you want to advance, you do it in a very small manner, right? You don't just jump into the next stroke. You very much build up to it like stairs, and that's the best way to teach ASD kids. So how to teach at home? And this is not really just like, go into the pool and teach your kid how to swim, but it's also how you can go to this beach or to a public pool and feel confident, again, that your kid is going to be okay, that you're going to be okay. So one, like I said, focus on habits. Habits are probably one of the most important things, okay? Those habits is how ASD kids feel most comfortable. And my first recommendation is try to get their ears in the water. Why? Because it kind of like, it helps with their sensory. Because like I said, they have like a very much overwhelming sensories and stuff like that. When you put their ears in the water, everything kind of calms down and it's very much easier for them. And to do that, you basically place their head on your shoulder and you look up, and you would have your head on their forehead and you would kind of press down. Now, initially, they will feel very uncomfortable. They will probably kick, they will scream. That is completely normal because this is a new way of like seeing this. It's completely normal. So to help your kid feel a little bit more comfortable with that, count to, let's say 3. Say 1, 2, 3, let go, give them a break, and do it once again, okay? So you lay them down on your shoulder, you hold their forehead, their ears are touching the water a bit, and again, 1, 2, 3. And over time, again, because you keep repeating it, they will end up recognizing it. And they'll be like, okay, once she counts to 3, we're done. And then do 1, 2, 3, 4. And then 1, 2, 3, 5. And then slowly start pushing them away from your shoulder. You're still holding them, right? And that kind of like helps them. And do that with every stroke, okay? Now every movement, right? If you want them to kick, move their legs. Again, count 1, 2, 3, give them a break. 1, 2, 3, give them a break. It really does help them, right? Because you're repetitive and they're aware. Now, avoid restricting their movement. This is, I don't just mean like kind of like be all over them. Kids need to experience their mistake, especially ASD kids. And that's kind of like what that environment does, right? That resistance, they're more able to recognize what is going to be wrong, what is right, what works for them, what doesn't. They really need that space to explore. And I understand as a parent or as an instructor or as a professional, you have this terrified thing where it's like, I gotta be okay, I'm taking care of this kid. But giving them a little bit of space is not the end of the world. It really is good. My favorite trick is you give them like some sort of like buoyant noodle, they hold on to it, right? And you hold on to their hands so they recognize that they need to hold it, right? You hold it, you let go for a second, you hold it again. Let go for a second and longer, slowly build that up so they recognize that buoyancy and what happens when they hold on to the noodle. And like I said, constant encouragement and smiling, okay? Make sure that they know that they're proud of you. Smiling, it doesn't just work for ASD kids, it's literally for every kid. Once they feel that encouragement, they're more likely to try harder, right? Because they feel great. Now, the other thing is like I said, try to spend time with other kids. So if you have a friend, right, take them to the beach, have their kids kind of connect because it does help socially in communicating. And more importantly, it helps build up that confidence. And that confidence is going to help in future development. And the most important one is be patient. Everything is going to be okay. It will be time. It will take some time. It might take 3 months or 4 months, or maybe it will even take a week. You don't know. But keep being patient and keep doing your job and keep encouraging. And I promise you, they will do exactly what their bodies are capable to do. And it is to swim. They have every ability to swim. And yeah, that basically concludes. So let's see if there's any questions. Okay. Okay. Let's see. Well, there's I'll just talk about some tips that you can do at home. If there's any questions, feel free to pop up. But another thing that helps is distractions. So if you have some sort of toys, right, you want to distract them from the swimming, especially if they're very much overwhelmed by swimming or they're very, very nervous. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, we're good. My bad. But so use some toys, right? If you have some toys, throw them around. Be like, let's go get that toy, or try to distract them with some songs, sing lullabies. It really does help when they're not just all focused on the movement. It helps to distract them a bit. It kind of calms them down, and if you throw the toy, you can like be like kick to that, and they're more motivated to do something. That's another thing that can happen. Um, I don't know if there's any questions. I think we're good so far. You can also, oh, okay. So the question is, how can parents introduce their autistic child to swimming, especially if they have sensory sensitivities? Now, that is very common, and I start by saying very, very slow. So there's two ways. One is very much aggressive, and it works. They're gonna be fine. And the other one is not as bad. So have them just like touch the water, put their feet into the water. Just have them slowly introduce into what is water, right? Their fingers, their feet, very, very slowly, and then slowly start like going to their knees, try splashing. Toys really do help. If you have some sort of bucket or some sort of toy, have them play with the water. That kind of builds their confidence, and you're more likely to introduce them to the water. And then after that, swimming goes on. The second one is more aggressive, and it is for kids that are very, very nervous or who have trouble listening or just focusing. And it's basically where you give them a big hug and you go into the water with them and make sure that you are hugging them so they can feel your skin, because they'll still be a bit stressed out, but it will be a little bit easier for them because they know you're there, and they will calm down over time. And if they're still acting out, again, sing some songs, try to distract them, tell them some stories, anything. A lot of ASD kids, they have like something specific that they're comfortable with, right? Like if it's a toy truck or if it's like some sort of song, something like that, bring that there to make them comfortable. And again, just be patient. Take step by step, take time by time, slowly. And over time, they'll become more confident. And once they're comfortable in the water, that's when you can start introducing the different strokes and floats. What advice would you give to families hesitant to try swimming due to sensory or behavioral concerns? Now, I've had actually a lot of parents who come up to me and they're very nervous about their kid, right, going to the water because, it's nerve-wracking. And I suggest, and it works for a lot, is you can ask the instructor to sit right there in the class, right? You can sit right there and you can sit with your kid, and it does help a lot of parents when they know that they're right there. You are more than welcome, and you have that right to do that. Don't feel scared to ask that. You're more than welcome to do that. And the second is you can try going in the water with them. Now, I'm not saying, full on deep, right? Even if it's just like putting their feet in the water or just slowly, going into the water or just some splashes or just playing with toys in the water, you will feel a little bit more comfortable and be patient. And another thing is you can talk to the instructor. Instructors, a lot of them are very, very sweet, and you can talk to them and you can address your concerns and you can make like a plan with the instructor, what to do, what not to do. And the other thing is just to be brave because your kid is more than capable of doing it. They just need a little bit of help. Okay, awesome. I think that is it. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope this helped. Bye.